Jesus comforts the sisters of Lazarus. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?"
Let me add my welcome to Mark's. My name is Chris. I'm one of the ministry interns here at Wollongong Baptist Church. If I haven't met you, I'd love to meet you after the service. Before I get into the talk tonight, I'm just going to quickly pray for us. So if you're the praying kind, please bow your heads with me. Father, this is a sensitive topic for a lot of us here. I pray that you help us to be at ease tonight. I pray that you help us to have our hearts open and our ears open, our minds open to understanding how you approach suffering in this world, Lord. And I pray that you help us to do that in your Son's name. Amen. There's so much suffering in this world, isn't there? And so most of us here have suffered in some way, whether we're holding someone else's hand through their suffering or we ourselves are suffering. And so tonight I will be talking about suffering in general. And this would include things like unexpected deaths, cancer, disabilities, to minor things like spraining your ankle or getting anxious over losing your wallet. And this is a heavy topic, especially if you yourself or you know someone who is going through tough times. And so if that's you, then I'm really sorry that you are going things right now, or that this talk brings up bad memories. And so I hope that the talk tonight helps us to consider how we can support others, but also that the message you hear may bring you a joy and a hope that you can reside in throughout your life. And so suffering, it is unpleasant, but there is moments of suffering which we can look back on and laugh at. I have an example of this. When I was in primary school, I walked into my bathroom and I saw a big chunk of mold sitting in the bathroom sink. And so as a young 8-9-year-old boy, this prompted my curiosity. I wanted to get my hands on this chunk of mold and just do something with it. And so what I did was I stuck my finger in the sink drain to try and get the mold out, but that didn't work. My finger ended up getting stuck in there. And so I tried to pull my finger out, and it was stuck. And so I started panicking. I called out for help, and my family ended up coming in, and my dad realized what happened, and so he sighed. And he said, "We're going to have to cut off your finger." And so he went outside, he grabbed a hacksaw, brought it back in, he took the blade off, and he started cutting away. And so I held my eyes shut and started to cry as I was expecting to feel the pain of a saw tearing away at my flesh and bone. Thankfully, he only cut through the plastic drain segment, and my finger was released. I grabbed my finger in disbelief that it was still attached. And so from this experience of suffering, I learned not to stick my finger in the sink drain again. And I've never done that since. And this is funny because who knew that sticking my finger in this sink drain would lead to potentially having it amputated? And so the trauma of this, it didn't stick around, but there are experiences of suffering in our lives that may never go away. Experiences can be sewn into the fabric of our lives, and they can be carried with us until we die. And so a word you can put to that is indelible. You can't erase it. And we may never move on from our suffering. Instead, we have to just move forward with the experience. We revisit the trauma in our everyday thoughts and dreams, and it can influence our personality, how we interact with the world, and how we interact with people. It can be a weight that we carry for months, years, decades, and even our entire lifetime. It can occupy our minds and emotions, preventing us from living a happy life. And so us Christians, we believe that God is all-powerful and that God is all-loving, yet suffering still exists. Surely this doesn't make sense. It's as if our Creator has abandoned us while we are down here worshipping Him. It's as if God sits back in His chair with a bag of popcorn and eats it and drinks his drink while He watches the world suffer. Does God really care? It's a common defeated belief. We suffer, therefore God doesn't care about us. So I'd like to point out the fact that suffering is normal, and sadly, it is not something that we can avoid in life. And so this is my first point, that we can't avoid our suffering. We can't avoid our suffering. When I was 12 years old, I was playing this medieval game in our backyard with my brother, who was 14, and my friend. And so what we did, we had sticks, which we pretended were swords, and I had a homemade bow as well. And so at one point, my brother leant downwards as I fired a stick at him. And so the wind lifted up the stick, and it ended up hitting him in the eye. He was rushed to hospital. And so he was there for a few days with the hope of regaining his eyesight. But an infection ended up springing up, and this was going to spread to his other eye and blind him in that eye and to his brain and kill him. And so our deep concern for him turned into a fear for his life. And so before he was rushed up to Sydney Eye Hospital, I remember sitting in the waiting room, watching him in his wheelchair, looking as if he'd just been in a swimming pool. He was drenched in that much sweat, and his eye was swollen to the size of a cricket ball. I sat there with the event playing over and over in my head, questioning what was going to happen to him. And so for the next month, he was being pumped with antibiotics to fight this infection. And so during this time up in Sydney, to distract myself, all I had with me was a stack of CDs, a CD player and some headphones, and for hours and hours every day for that month, I would listen to music just to distract myself from the anxiety. Each night before bed, I would dread the unfortunate circumstance and pray that my brother would come out alive and with his eyesight. And so engulfed in this anxiety and countless repetitive questioning thoughts, my tear reservoir dried up, and the days dragged by as this nightmare of an event played out in reality. The concern I had for the results were immense. Thankfully, my brother came out alive. And this was such a relief, but sadly, he is now permanently blind in one eye. A traumatic burden that he will carry for the rest of his life. Unfair, isn't it? What did my brother do to carry such a burden? He was only 14. This wasn't a result of a sin he did in the past. And even though we could do something about it, and we could comfort him, this did not completely remove the suffering. And so I'm sure there's a lot of people who can relate to an unfortunate situation like this here in our safe first world country. This is what happens in this world. We suffer. And the Bible doesn't shy away from the reality of this. The passage we read earlier has an example for us. Let's turn back to John chapter 11, verses 17 to 21. And it says, "On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. 'Lord,' Martha said to Jesus, 'if you had been here, my brother would not have died.'" Earlier in the chapter before this passage, we can read that Lazarus was sick and that this was the cause of his death. And so Lazarus, he suffered through this illness, and now Martha and Mary are suffering through his loss, grieving the loss of a loved one. And so this is an experience that they could not avoid. What Mary and Martha experienced is something that we experience as well: unexpected suffering. They were helplessly waiting for Lazarus to get better, but his sickness didn't go away, and they were sitting in agony as his life was ended. There's something wrong about this. Where was God in this moment? And so we fear that things like this happen to us, and we approach life with caution. We attempt to avoid suffering, though it still gets the best of us. And if it's not that there's something wrong with the world that God created, suffering is a part of this world. And this makes life very painful sometimes. The only thing that people could do for Mary and Martha was to comfort them. And so that's what the best we can offer other people in this world. It's to comfort them. And what does that solve? We are still suffering. We want to escape it, but we are stuck in it as the rest of the world keeps moving on. And when we are suffering, we may not be in a state of mind to communicate it. Maybe we don't want to burden others, or we feel like that they can't help us, or that they won't understand. Maybe we are so consumed by our traumatic thoughts that we just cannot share what we are feeling. Comfort is the best we can receive or give, but it does not fix the problem. And as much as we were able to comfort my brother as he was fighting an infection, it didn't fix the problem. As much as we sat in distress, it didn't bring my brother's eyesight back. And when it comes to suffering, we are left helpless as it takes control of our lives. We can't avoid suffering. And this is where it's helpful to know that God understands our suffering as he enters our suffering, which is my second point, that God enters our suffering. That God enters our suffering. And so one important thing that you should know about Christianity is that Jesus is God in human form. He's both fully God and fully man. He's God who's put on flesh and he's come down to earth to experience what we're experiencing, to live among us. He breathes our air. He eats the same food. He feels our emotion. He lives amongst us as one of us. He's a relational God. He comes close to us, as close as you can get. And this is what separates Christianity from every other religion in the world. The gods of all the other religions remain distant. They watch from afar, expecting you to reach their standard with your efforts. They remain indifferent, not showing care and understanding towards us. And so it wouldn't bother them if you rejected them. What have they done for you to receive something back anyway? God does not keep himself distant from us. Instead, he shows us that he loves us and understands us. Let's have a look at the passage to see what God does when he enters the world as a God-man, Jesus. So verses 32 to 36 of John 11 say this. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. Mary knows who Jesus is, and she places the weight of her brother Lazarus' death on Jesus, and she cries in sorrow and grief. She could be thinking things like, how is it fair that my brother's life was taken away? You could have done something about this, Jesus. Why did you allow this to happen? Mary and Martha placed the blame of the suffering on Jesus as he didn't come and acted on the situation because they knew he could stop it. The God-man Jesus who entered this world, he ends up responding with understanding. He enters their suffering. As it says in verse 33, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Jesus feels the weight of the suffering that they are experiencing, and he responds appropriately. He doesn't just respond to the suffering, he also suffers with them. He's overwhelmed with grief and sorrow. And we can see this in verse 34 to 36, which says, where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. And then the Jews said, see how he loved him. Crying is our body's physical reaction to the emotional stress that's built up inside us. And this Jesus, the Son of God, he weeps in response to the suffering that was taking place here. This is God crying in sorrow and grief over Lazarus' death. God understands what we are going through. A part of the Bible describes Jesus like this. It's from Isaiah chapter 53, verses 3 to 4. It says, he was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. And this may not be the God of Christianity that you thought he was. God comes so close to us that he experiences our grief and our pain and our suffering. God who shows us that he understands our suffering. And one of the biggest drives in this world is to relieve our suffering and even attempt to end our suffering. There's many organizations and businesses out there who invest in curative and preventative care to help people get better. But sadly, people also use destructive means of alleviating their suffering. They use things like drugs and alcohol and pornography as a distraction and a temporary relief with a cost. Gaming, for example, can be used as a distraction from reality. In 1999, the science fiction film The Matrix came out. And it was about a man named Neo who ended up waking up from a simulation of our reality. And he discovered that he was in a world, a futuristic dystopian future where machines had taken over. And so they hooked people up to a simulation of a reality like ours, and they end up harvesting energy from them. In a similar way, some of us, including myself, has used gaming to distract from unpleasant circumstances in life. And currently, virtual reality is becoming the norm, and people could use it to serve as a distraction from their suffering and a distraction from this life completely. With all these different means of alleviating suffering, people are trying to escape reality, attempting to avoid the suffering, attempting to end suffering. And so our world is so complex and full of selfishness that all of these attempts to relieve or end our suffering will never completely remove it. We can't end our suffering. And so brings me to my third point, where God ends our suffering by suffering for us. God ends our suffering by suffering for us. Jesus deals with the cause of the suffering. And so we can look back at the passage to see this. So John chapter 11, verse 38 to 43. This comes after the passage that we had read out earlier. It says that Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Jesus just ended the driving force behind the suffering that they were experiencing in the loss of Lazarus. Without any effort at all Jesus had to do was speak, and Lazarus rose from the dead. The God-man Jesus has shown us that he has the power to end our suffering. And Jesus also promises a time that there will be no more suffering. And we can see this in the disciple John's prophecy at the end of the Bible, in the book of Revelation. So Revelation chapter 21, verse 4 says this: He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. So try and imagine being in a place where there isn't a single hint of suffering. We are so used to everyday discomfort, so used to protecting ourselves from situations that bring suffering. To fathom being in a place where it doesn't exist at all is just way out of our scope. How do we enter this existence? If this is the future that's really on offer, I have one question for us. How does it become our future? And so if we investigate into who Jesus is, we'll discover that God has shown us the ultimate act of care towards our suffering. Not just a care that comforts like we saw in the recording of Lazarus, but a care where God ends our suffering completely. He gives us the opportunity to enter an existence without suffering if we choose to accept it. And so how has God brought an end to our suffering? I've got a bit of an illustration which might help us understand. So during my Bachelor of Civil Engineering, there was a subject I did, which was a bridge design subject, and so we were in a team of 6. And so what we had to do was, over the semester, we had to design a bridge, and we had to approach all aspects of the design. So this included hydraulic design, geotechnical, wind design, road, reinforced concrete, and beam design. And so this was a monster of a project. That was the whole subject. And in our first meeting, we allocated a person to each section. But there was a lot of tension during this first meeting. Everyone hoped to get the easiest part of this project, and everyone was praying that they wouldn't get the reinforced concrete design aspect. And so when it was time to allocate, the leader asked for a volunteer, and there was silence. And even I myself felt anxious, hoping that I wouldn't be voluntold by the leader. Thankfully, there was one brave man who put his hand up, and that relieved all of us. The poor guy probably ended up crying himself to sleep that night. He made a great sacrifice for the rest of us. And so in a much, much greater way, God himself makes a sacrifice for us. God himself suffers for us. And so if you are visiting tonight and you are new to Christianity, this may not be a phrase that you expected to hear. There's a passage in the Old Testament about God entering our suffering through Jesus dying on the cross to end our suffering. And so it's back in the book of Isaiah, in the same chapter we looked at before, chapter 53. And so verses 5 to 6 say this: "But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." Jesus took on the punishment that we deserve for rejecting God. Not the suffering that we're experiencing now here on earth, but the suffering that we deserve for our wrongdoing, for our sin, the suffering that we will experience after this life for rejecting God, as our choice for rejecting God. As verse 6 says, "We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way." It doesn't matter whether we think we've sinned or not. It's not our own standards which we are trying to meet. It's our Creator's. And so you may have responded to this in fear, or you may have responded to this in anger. And they're not wrong responses at all, but you don't have to feel this way. We don't have to feel this way. Why? Because as it says at the end of verse 6, the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. To enter God's presence where there is no more death, no more mourning, no more crying, no more pain, we need to deal with the issue of sin which separates us from God. Because the standard we need to meet to be in God's presence is perfection. And it is dealt with through Jesus. He is the sinless one who died on the cross so that our sin can be dealt with and that we can be justified. Or to put it another way, we can be declared perfect. We can be declared righteous. And so this means that the just punishment that we deserve for going astray, for living the way that we want to live, is placed on God's perfect servant, Jesus, as he takes on all of our rejection of God, our iniquities. If we trust that Jesus' death on the cross did all of the work. And this is wonderful news. And so even if we might be going through really tough times right now, if we trust in Jesus, we can look forward to an eternal life without suffering after we die. And we can see this back in the passage we read as Martha speaks to Jesus. So looking back at chapter 11, verses 23 to 27, it says that Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die." Do you believe this? "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is come into the world." Knowing this is a comfort throughout our lives. Here Martha is comforted by Jesus as he reassures her that Lazarus will rise again when he returns to judge the world. And not just Lazarus, but anyone who believes in Jesus will live even though they die, as it says in verse 25. Not just temporarily, but eternally. As it says in verse 26, he says, "Whoever lives by believing in me will never die." Jesus makes this claim, and then he backs it up because he just rose Lazarus from the dead. Martha herself professes that she believes this. She identifies him in verse 27 as the Messiah that they have been waiting for. She identifies him as the Son of God who has come into this world we suffer in to redeem us by suffering God's anger that we deserve. And so we need to recognize this because we don't belong in this world of suffering. We are made to be in the presence of Creator where there is no suffering. And this life isn't easy. We will all suffer in some way. and we can't end our suffering. So we do need to stand by each other and comfort each other and support each other through all our anxieties, our depression, our insecurities, our pain, our sorrow, our grief. God does know what we're experiencing as He's entered our suffering. And so we can lean on God and His help by talking to Him. We can tell Him how we feel, and we can ask Him for His help. And if you are going through tough things right now, or you know someone that is, then at the end of the service tonight, myself or one of the pastors or the elders will be up the front here, and you can come up and we will pray with you. And so we are in a world where suffering, it should be expected, and we can't prevent it from happening. Comfort is helpful, but it doesn't fix the problem. That's where we can look to God, who has done something to end our suffering. And this is the best news that we will ever hear in our entire lifetime. The fact that if you put your trust in Jesus' death and resurrection, you will enter an existence without suffering. God has shown that He cares about our suffering, and He has an eternity waiting for us without suffering, where there is no death or mourning or crying or pain, as promised in His word. And so can I please urge you to investigate Jesus further? Chat to your Christian friend who brought you along. Pick up a Bible, have a read of it. Look at the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. That's a good place to start. It's definitely worth your time. So I'm going to pray for us in response to this, and then we'll stand and sing. Father, we are in a world where we suffer, and so many of us have experienced horrible things, Lord, and you do know we are going through this. I pray that you help us to rely on you through this. I pray that you give us strength through this. I pray that you provide people to support us through our suffering, Lord. I pray that you help us to identify when other people are suffering. I pray that you help us to take action and support them and love them and take care of them. Ultimately, Lord, thank you so much that you have ended our suffering for the future. Father, I pray that we can trust in Jesus and what He's done on the cross, so that we can enter this existence without suffering, Lord, that where we will be in your presence and we will fully experience your love. I pray that you help us to hold on to our faith in Jesus. And I thank you so much that you have come close to us through Jesus, and you haven't remained distant. In your Son's name, amen.